In Book 1 of the Politics, Aristotle describes the origins of the state. It's not only fundamentally important for the rest of his political philosophy and his account of justice, but it's also useful for us to think with, to use to sharpen our reasoning about the nature of political life. Because in many ways, it's distinct, it's different from the way that we often think about the nature of the state in the modern world. Aristotle says at the very beginning of Book 1 that the human state is an association that exists by nature. And there's so much packed into those words. The state is an association that exists by nature. So this is deeply embedded in Aristotle's entire philosophy of nature. Aristotle says that the state exists according to nature. That, in fact, going back into the discussion of the sophists, the state is not merely a convention. The state is not a convention. It's not a creation of human action. It's not a creation of the human will. It's something that exists by nature. And Aristotle says that the state is an association. The state is a group of humans that are bound together in a certain way. He says that the origins of the state, the kernel, the seed of the state, is the family. And the family, of course, is natural. Humans naturally exist in reproductive units in order to continue the generation of the species. There's no other way for the species to go on. It's entirely natural, biological, we would say. And the family is the most original unit of society. Beyond the family, though, humans begin to band together into villages out of mutual need. And we saw this much in Plato's political philosophy, already in the Republic. Plato says that states exist because of mutual need and difference of aptitude. And so far, Aristotle closely follows his teacher, Plato. And there are many similarities between Aristotle's political philosophy and Plato's. And Aristotle says that families band together into villages out of a sort of need. They interact, they trade with each other, they exchange and they protect each other. But he says that the village is not the ultimate organization of human social life. That villages, in fact, band together to form the polis, the city-state. And in Aristotle's thought world, the city-state, the polis, is the fundamental unit of human political life. Aristotle says that the polis is an association which exists by nature. The humans naturally form families, families naturally form into villages, and villages naturally form into a polis, a sovereign unity that exists according to nature. And Aristotle believes that the polis is the natural environment of the human being. In fact, Aristotle famously says that humans are political animals, that man is a zoon politikon. Zoon is just the word for animal. Humans are a creature, we're an animal that lives in a polis. So we are politikon, that is that we are natively suited to live in a polis. What does Aristotle mean by this? Well, he says that human beings alone have two faculties that make them suited to live in a polis. They have speech and they have moral reason. Now, there are other animals that make noises, but there's no other animal that has logos, a word that means reason and speech. No other animal has the communicative ability that human beings do. We are naturally, our voice boxes and brains make us naturally endowed to live in society. He also says that we have moral reason. There are other animals that have reason, right? We have animals that can use their brains, but there's no other creature that has moral reason in the way that human beings do. This is Aristotle's claim. Human beings can recognize advantage. They can recognize injustice. And these two faculties in combination, speech and moral reason, mean that nature meant for human beings to live in political society. Humans aren't meant to live isolated lives individually by themselves. They are endowed by their very natural capacities to live a political kind of life. And in fact, Aristotle draws another consequence from this, an important one. He says, because these are our natural capacities, humans can only flourish. They can only be fully achieving their excellence through the fulfillment of these faculties. So that humans can only flourish. They can only live the fullest human life in society. That is, if you're living on an island by yourself, that you cannot exercise your natural faculties to their fullest extent, and that you cannot achieve the fullest human excellences, that you can't live a fully virtuous life individually, because you can't exercise these kinds of natural endowments. And so for Aristotle, not only is the state natural, but in fact human beings are naturally equipped and can only live truly excellent lives in the context of the polis. It's an amazing idea. And in contrast to this, Aristotle imagines a state that exists by contract. And when we come to later political thinkers like Hobbes and Locke, we'll see the idea that the state exists by a kind of compact, that humans originate in a state of nature and agree to create a sovereign entity, a state. And Aristotle has this idea available to him. It exists in the world that he inhabits. It's an idea that's presented by the sophists, the idea that the state is created by a contract, by a compact, by an agreement in which humans willingly create a sovereign entity. Aristotle, in fact, expresses this idea as a possibility in the politics only to reject it explicitly and to say that the state is not a creation of human will, that the state is more than a human agreement. And Aristotle says this has an important consequence. A state is not a kind of social compact of the sort that the sophists imagine. The sophists imagine that the state is a creation, a compact, in which humans agree to recognize each other's rights and not to injure each other and their property. Aristotle says this, in fact, pulls out an important distinction between a state that exists by contract and a state that exists by nature. Aristotle says that the idea that the state exists by contract is, in fact, like a treaty. So, say the US and Russia have a treaty that is a mutual defense treaty or an agreement not to harm each other. Say NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That's a treaty organization, and it's a mutual defense compact on certain North Atlantic states. That is not a state. It's not a political society, Aristotle would say. That is simply an agreement for mutual defense. But the state is something much more than that. A state is an association. Think about what this means. An association is a kind of group that exists for some purpose. And so we might form an association for the protection of animals. And so an association can be a group that exists for some purpose, like the protection of animals, like the promotion of useful knowledge, like some other charitable purpose. These would be associations with some specific purpose. Aristotle says the state is an association that exists by nature, and it exists for a very particular purpose, the highest purpose of all, flourishing. Aristotle says that the state is a unit that exists by nature to promote human flourishing, that the state is an association that has a purpose, and that purpose is eudaimonia. And from this idea, Aristotle will derive consequences about what the state should be and how it should be organized. And on this basis, Aristotle derives his constitutional theories and his philosophy of justice.